Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Thank you for coming, giving up some of your time. We're going to discuss the United Nations, what it is and what it has always been. But I always like to start off with a little bit of humor, if I can find some. I'm not a fan of late-night television. I know some people look forward every night to watching Letterman or Jay Leno or some of these guys. And I know that some of those programs are things you shouldn't be watching. I mean, it's not what you call anything other than a moral cesspool sometimes. I've been told anyhow. But I do have friends who watch it occasionally, and they tell me that sometimes Jay Leno comes across with some very witty remarks, right? And I didn't make these up, he did. But I think they're terrific. You heard a little bit about the fact that we got an immigration problem here. We've got the amnesty program about to be given to Congress. So Jay Leno said, well, he said, we got to stop calling these people illegal immigrants. We got to start calling them undocumented Democrats. That strikes a chord with me, right? And I can remember a few years ago, one time, when they were talking about the fact that Iraq needed a new constitution. We got to get Iraq a new constitution. He says, why don't we give them ours? We're not using it. Well, that shall be the end of my humor, unless I think of something else in the middle. I also want to tell you that we're going to be talking about the United Nations. And in 2001, the nation of Switzerland was facing a national referendum. They do things by referendum over there quite frequently. And the referendum on this particular occasion was whether or not the nation should join the United Nations. They'd been invited to do so and had resisted for many, many years. And so the people around Zurich, the German part, the French part is the western part, the people around Zurich somehow got a hold of me and asked me to come and give some talks on the United Nations. Right? So I did. I gave 2 talks to probably the most savvy people in the nation of Switzerland about world affairs. Right? These people had their own publication, and it was pretty good. It was good stuff. So I gave 2 talks, and at the end of the talks, I was asked by one of the group leaders. He said to me, you mean it was bad from the very beginning? And I nodded my head and I said, yeah, that's the message I conveyed, isn't it? He shook his head. Well, you don't have to say that to a lot of people in the United States today. You don't have to tell them it was bad from the very beginning. There are a lot of people now who know, right? And I hope that before this evening is over, many more of you will know, maybe for the first time, that the United Nations is something we should never gotten involved in, right? So let's move ahead. And we talk about commonly held attitudes regarding the United Nations. Don't you run into people every once in a while say, well, it's just a forum for people to blow off steam, right? How many of you have heard the word bloviating, right? Isn't that what they do at the UN? Bloviate, I love that word, right? All right, there are other people who say it never accomplished anything, right? Well, tell that to some of the countries that have lost their freedom because the United Nations bombed them into smithereens. There are other people who say, well, all you need to do with the UN is reform it, right? And I say to them, wait a minute, if you have cancer, you don't reform it, you get rid of it. Other people say, well, we got to get better leaders at the UN. Some of the leaders they've had aren't the best, right? No way that's going to happen. But then I hear people say, well, the UN is good because they feed hungry children, right? Well, you know they do. Occasionally they do feed hungry children, right? But then they make that country pay for it in the loss of freedom. And then there are other people who say, well, it's a place to talk rather than fight, and we got to have that. We got to have a place to talk rather than fight. And so I say to them, well, if the United States has a problem with this country or that country or this country, why take it to the United Nations? We've already got an ambassador in that country. Why not keep it between him and us, right? Him and the other country? Why involve 193 nations in a squabble between two? And so that argument doesn't stand at all. That's another one of those arguments. Okay, let's move on. The United Nations, it really doesn't amount to much, some people say. Who do you think fills that building in New York? Right? That building's not empty. And what are all the people who are in that building doing? Right? They're working to subvert your freedom. But they have other buildings too. Here's the International Monetary Fund. That's a United Nations organization. That's down in Washington. Just think of all the people in that building. Here's the International Labor Organization in Geneva, Switzerland. They need that big building to meddle in people's labor. Here's the World Health Organization in Geneva. Right? Here's the International Criminal Court that the Obama administration is now making overtures to for us to get involved in. Just imagine all the people in these buildings. And there are those who say the United Nations doesn't get anything done. They don't do anything. What do these people do? Right? Here's the World Bank back in Washington, D.C. The United Nations they're all over the world. Now, I don't have the buildings for the Food and Agriculture thing of the United Nations. That's in Rome, Italy. Or the World Health Organization. That's in Geneva, Switzerland. Or the Seabed Authority in Jamaica, or the Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, and the Maritime Organization in London. And I don't have the buildings for the other organizations and agencies in Tokyo and Bangkok and Montreal and Paris and Nairobi, and on and on and on we go. There are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people working in these buildings. And they're up to no good, right? So let's contrast. Let's go back to the roots of our country. I always love to do this. No matter what talk I'm giving, I'm going to start with this. The Declaration of Independence, the philosophical base of our country. And it's in two little passages right at the beginning. Men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. What does it say? It says there is a God, and He gave us our rights, and we use our rights and powers to form a government for what purpose? To safeguard those rights and nothing more. The concept of government should be a negative force has been lost. We got to bring it back. Government should not be a positive force, should not be going around doing something for you or for me or for everybody else because they got to take from me to give to you or you to give to me and gain control over both of us in the process. Right? Government should be a negative force. Stop the criminals, right? Even stop the ones that are in government. There's the philosophical base of the United States of America in two very small passages at the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. And to make that stick, they came along with the Constitution of the United States. And the Constitution of the United States said government can do this and can do this and can do this. And then they came forward with the Bill of Rights. And I always love that 10th item in the Bill of Rights because it says, beginning with the Bill of Rights, it says Congress shall not, shall not, shall not, shall not, all the way up to that marvelous 10th Amendment that says if we forgot anything, you can't do that either. Right? Right? Congress shall make no law. All right, now let's contrast that. Let's show what the United Nations is all about. Here's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 1948, they came out with this. Everyone shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law. We say Congress shall make no law, and they say that the United Nations can make a law anytime they want to impede their rights. And there it is, right in their own document. Then they came out in 1966 with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And they actually said in this, rights may be subject to certain restrictions, but these shall only be such as are provided by law and are necessary. Contrast that with Congress shall make no law, and you see the difference. We have no business being in the United Nations. It's a total contradiction of the American philosophical base. Right? Now, we could stop right there, and I'd take a vote, and I bet all of you would say, yeah, okay, McManus, I'm with you. Let's get out of the United Nations. Right? We don't have to go any further, do we? Right? But we will. what we will. Here's an interesting thing. You go to the Constitution of the Soviet Union, the 1955, we have it pictured here, and we find the same thinking as is in the United Nations. They list all of the rights that you have, that the government has given you, not God, right? The government has given you, and they say at the end of it that we can pass a law that says you don't have this right anymore, right? Same as the United Nations. Now, we know, if we know any history, we know that there have been people throughout history who have wanted world government, right? They're not satisfied with dominating a country or several countries. They want the world, right? There was a fellow named Adam Weishaupt in 1776, started the Illuminati conspiracy. There was Giuseppe Mazzini, who started the Carbonari that took over from the Illuminati in Italy. Right? There was Karl Marx, who was the father of communism and socialism, right? And he spawned Stalin and Lenin and a lot of others that are just brutal murderers. Right? And then there was a man named Edward Mandell House. And he didn't talk about world government in so many words. He talked about a comity of nations, right? Not too many people use the word comedy anymore, right? It almost sounds like comedy, funny, funny. No, it's not. Nothing funny about this. He wanted world government. He called it the comity of nations, right? And he wrote a book, did this Edward Mandell House, a book called Philip Drew, Administrator. And in his book, which was published in 1912, he had a dedicatory quote right at the beginning from Giuseppe Mazzini. He's one of the men that I mentioned as a world governor. He's the second one on that list. That's very significant that he would quote Mazzini. He was the advisor, was House, to Presidents Wilson and FDR. He said in his book he was working for socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx, so I will call him a Marxist, right? Because of what he wrote. He despised the U.S. Constitution. He advocated the income tax and the Federal Reserve. We got both in 1913 through his efforts. Right? He proposed world government at the end of World War I, and happily the U.S. Senate said no. And so then he launched the Council on Foreign Relations to instruct the American people to want world government. Right? And the Council on Foreign Relations is a very powerful organization. Now, in 1919, the U.S. Senate voted as to whether or not to join the League of Nations. And they debated the matter for 9 months and said no. We owe those senators who said no a big debt of gratitude, right? 9 months it took them. Here's the book, The Shadows of Power, The History of the Council on Foreign Relations. This is the organization that really is the elite in our country. They run the show. The media, the government, the clergy, the military, corporations, the educational world, and there's only 4,500 of them. But where they are is very, very important. Sometimes people come to me and say, okay, what book should I read? Now, I've written several books. You heard somebody mention that. I've written several books, and yeah, I want you to read the books I've written. But if I had to get anybody to read one book, this is it, The Shadows of Power. It will open your eyes as to why our country is defeating itself. Right? All right, let's move ahead now. We saw that the U.S. Senate said no in 1919 to the League of Nations. And so the people who wanted world government needed a crisis. And the crisis came at a place called Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, December 7th, 1941. The day after that, the United States declared war on Japan, justifiably so. And interestingly, Germany and Italy then declared war on the United States because they had a pact with Japan. And they said, if you go to war, we go with you. Right? So they declared war on us, and then immediately the U.S. Congress declared war back on Germany and Italy. And now we had a world war going on two fronts, Europe and the Pacific. In a matter of days, we were at war on two fronts. But it was a crisis. And of course, a crisis is something that people like. They need a crisis because a crisis, was it Rahm Emanuel said, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, right? So when you have a crisis, you use it to get your way. Now, that was December 7th of 1941. In January of 1942, 1 month later, formal declaration of the United Nations was proclaimed by diplomats in Washington, D.C. There wasn't any United Nations then. In 1943, the U.S., the United Kingdom, Soviet Union, China agreed to form a world government. In 1944, at the famous Dumbarton Oaks Conference, they created the initial draft of the UN Charter. Dumbarton Oaks is an estate in Washington, D.C. In 1945, the San Francisco Conference. It met from April until the end of June, and it produced the Charter of the United Nations, and 50 nations agreed to it. Okay? And so the United Nations was formed. The United Nations came back. His VE Day, this was in May of 1945, victory in Europe. And then Japan surrendered on August 14th, 1945. Now, I'm old enough to remember that period. I knew what was going on at the time. I was only 10 years old, but I knew. I knew that they were forming the United Nations, and I asked my dad about it. My dad, a very patriotic American. And he said, we got to try something new. We've already had World War I, we've had World War II, and we don't want to have World War III, so we got to try something new. So I said, you think that what we should do is get into this United Nations? He says, yeah, let's give it a try. And that's how they sold it to the American people, right? Overwhelmingly so. But at the founding conference of the United Nations, the U.S. delegation had 16 secret communists, had 43 members of the Council on Foreign Relations in the delegation. And the chief of the conference was Alger Hiss, who was later found out to be one of those communists. Right? So it was a stacked deck. The chief authors of the UN Charter were Andrei Vyshinsky of the Soviet Union, an open communist. Everybody knew he was a communist. And Alger Hiss of the United States, who was a secret communist. Nobody knew at the time, except fellow communists. Right? And this is what produced the United Nations Charter. And so the Senate got to vote on the UN Charter and whether or not we should join. And they debated the matter a mere 6 days. In 1919, they debated it for 9 months and said no. In 1945, they debated for 6 days and they said yes, and the vote was 89 to 2. Only 2 senators said no. And you've all heard the names of those 2 senators. They're household names, right? Henrik Shipstead of Minnesota and William Langer of North Dakota. You've all heard of them, right? Well, someday we're going to build a monument to those 2 men, right? Right. And so the United States was now in the United Nations. And the first meeting of the United Nations was held in New York City at a place called Lake Success, which was where they had the World's Fair of 1939. I also went to that. Right? And then they built the headquarters over in Manhattan. All right. Now, I got the speeches of Henrik Shipstead and William Langer, and I read through those speeches. And these men nailed it, these 2 men. Shipstead said control of the war power must remain in Congress, and he saw that the United Nations Charter would take that away. Langer said the UN would have the authority to send our boys all over the earth. Ladies and gentlemen, we now have troops in 130 nations throughout the world, and none of them are without United Nations authorization. Here's another man named J. Reuben Clark. He was a diplomat. He had served as an ambassador to several countries, and he was in the State Department for a while. He read the Charter, and look what he said. The Charter is a war document, not a peace document, that makes it practically certain we shall have future wars. It removes the power to declare wars, and didn't it? And to choose which side we'll be on, and determine the equipment that will be used, and to command our sons who do the fighting. J. Reuben Clark was absolutely right, but he was a lone wolf, as you might say, among the diplomats. So let's take a look at the charter. I have a copy of the charter here, and it's a smaller document than the Constitution of the United States, right? It's just a few pages. All right, let's look at a couple of the articles in it. Article 1 uses the word peace 6 times. And so the UN goes around, tells everybody it's a peace organization, right? But Article 2 authorizes war. So you're going to have war to make peace? George Orwell. We're back to George Orwell, right? I got some real good news the other day. My 16-year-old grandson told me that he's been assigned to read George Orwell's books in his class in high school. I was thrilled, right? If you've never read 1984 or anything else that George Orwell ever wrote, you ought to, right? All right, the UN Charter now. Let's look at number 2, Article number 2. It discusses the application of enforcement measures that you'll find in Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. Well, didn't they just say they were a peace organization 6 times? Now they're talking about the application of enforcement measures. So we go to Chapter 7, and what does that say? It authorizes demonstrations, blockade, and other operations by air, sea, or land forces of the United Nations. The peace organization? Right? This is newspeak. This is George Orwell, right? All right, Article 25. Now, let's suppose you're a United States Senator. It's 1945. You're asked to vote on whether or not we should join the United Nations, and you look through the Charter and you see Article 25. And this is the whole article. It says, the members of the United Nations agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the present Charter. Would you have signed that? Does that not trump the Constitution of the United States? It certainly does. Right? The Security Council passes a resolution, and we are bound by Article 25 to support it and to carry out the decision. To invade this country, to go here, to go there, to go wherever. Langer and Shipstead read that and said, no, thanks. Others read it and said, well, we got to give peace a chance. Where did they get the military forces? Well, if you're going to force peace on people, your kind of peace, you got to have a military, don't you? And so we see Article 43. It says all members of the United Nations undertake to make available to the Security Council armed forces, assistance, and facilities, including the rights of passage necessary for the purpose of maintaining international peace and security. So all member states of the United Nations are required, after they join the United Nations, to make available to the Security Council on its command the military forces to carry out the will of the United Nations. Would you have signed on for that?
Absolutely not.
Well, 89 senators did. 89 senators did. I get up to a little bit more modern here. We get to Colin Powell, February of 2001. Look what he said. With respect to U.S. policy, when it comes to our role as a member of the Security Council, we obviously are bound by UN resolutions. He should have been fired on the spot. He should have been given a retirement fund and said, get out of here. Or maybe no retirement fund, right? But this is what's going on. Here's George H.W. Bush. It is the sacred principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter to which the American people will henceforth pledge their allegiance. Sacred principles, right? To use war at your discretion against any country on earth. To compel people from the United States to send their sons and now their daughters to do the work of the United Nations. No, no. The United Nations then had to have some more legislation passed in the United States. This is a very little known piece of legislation. It's the United Nations Participation Act. Now, the charter was signed in July of 45. The first meeting of the UN was in October of 45. And in December of 1945, the United States Congress debated the United Nations Participation Act, which says that the president shall not be deemed to require authorization of Congress to send troops to enforce Security Council resolutions. Now, how many do you suppose voted for that? It was 89-2 in the Senate to get us in. Well, there was a wonderful lady congressperson from Illinois named Jessie Sumner. And she came out in December of 1945, just before that was voted. She said, this measure gives congressional authority for surrendering the American people to an all-powerful world supergovernment. God bless you, Jessie Sumner. There was a doctor over in Ohio who had become a congressman, Frederick Smith. He said of this United Nations Participation Act, this measure strikes at the very heart of the Constitution. It provides that the power to declare war shall be taken from Congress and given to the president. Here is the essence of dictatorship. Right on, right on. And so they voted, and the House approved it 344 to 15. Only 15 stalwarts said no. You see, we had to try something new. We had to give the UN some power. We don't want a World War III, right? That's the thinking of the American people. And the Senate approved it by a voice vote. Now, there's a bill before Congress right now, and we'll get to that before we finish, and it's to withdraw our nation from the United Nations. And the very first part of that bill is to repeal the United Nations Participation Act. Right? Yeah. So there are some people in Congress who have... There are some people in Congress who have begun to figure it out. And there are more people in Congress who need to figure it out, and that's your job, right? Every one of you in this room, it's your job to get them to figure it out. Even as good a senator as Robert Taft of Ohio, somebody my father greatly revered, somebody I know Robert Welsh thought the world of, even he voted for the UN Charter in July of 1945. And very soon he said, the UN has become a trap, let's go it alone. And he tried to stop it at that point and didn't succeed. Now we go back to the UN Charter, and we go to Articles 52, 3, and 4, and we see that there's the authorization to create NATO and CETO. The Charter says Security Council shall utilize such regional arrangements for enforcement action under its authority. Is NATO a United Nations organization? Yes, always has been. Is it only act with the authority of the United Nations? Yes. Was it sold to the American people that way? No. No, we were told that NATO, we needed NATO to keep the Soviet Union from moving further west after they'd conquered all of Eastern Europe and enslaved Poland and Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Ukraine, and so many other countries. The UN Charter says Security Council shall be kept fully informed of activities. All right? Now this is key. Keep that. Security Council shall be kept fully informed of activities. I want to show you what happened. Right? Secretary of State Dean Acheson, if he wasn't a communist, he was cheating them out of dues. Right? He gave a speech when NATO was being discussed in 1949. It was actually formed in 1949. He said it's an essential measure for strengthening the United Nations. What more do you need to know about it? Right? That's NATO. NATO was created in 1949, derives authority to exist from the UN Charter. Only 13 senators voted no. NATO, with 28 member nations now, is now in charge of the Afghanistan war that we're involved in. NATO's in charge, right? What did we say? Security Council shall be kept fully informed of activities, right? So our men are over there, and they've got an operation planned, and it goes to the UN, and who does the UN give it to? Anybody they want to give it to, including the Taliban. Yeah, I don't know that they do that. They have the capability of doing it. Okay, so NATO was formed in 1949, and the Korean War started in June of 1950. North Korea invaded South Korea. The UN Security Council said all members send forces, right? Now, did all members send forces to Korea to fight against the communist invasion? No, no. Who sent most of the forces, right? I'll bet there are some men right in this audience who served in Korea, right? I wouldn't be surprised at all, right? So the U.S. supplies the bulk of the troops, upwards of 90%, and there's no declaration of war. Well, how can we go to war without a declaration of war? Doesn't the Constitution of the United States say we must go to Congress to get a declaration of war? Yeah, it does say that. But the United Nations Participation Act overcame that. And it gave the president the power to send troops to go and support UN resolutions, right? So there were some reporters, some dowdy reporters, that went to President Truman and said, well, you can't do this. What are you doing? And he said, we're not at war. This is a police action. And then he said this. He said, if I can send troops to NATO, which I've already done, I can send troops to Korea. Right? And he did. And so our troops in Korea were flying UN flags. They didn't know any better. Even General Douglas MacArthur, who I revere, the memory of Douglas MacArthur, very, very big in my head. And he was a great, great military leader and a good American. He didn't know. He ordered flags to fly over our troops from the UN. But they quickly found out that there was something wrong here, and they started taking those flags down. Right? Now, the Korean War was fought until 1953, when there was an armistice, but there has never been an end to the war. It's a state of war, still exists. We have almost 40,000 American troops stationed in South Korea. And you know, I believe we can't bring them home unless the UN allows us to bring them home. Everybody in the military who has ever served in Korea, not just during the war, but at any time since 1950, has served in the United Nations Command. Was there any of those men in arms ever given a choice to say, is it okay if we transfer you to the United Nations Command? No, no, they just did it. It had to be about 12, maybe 15 years ago that I went to a recruiting station for the military in a town where I live in Massachusetts. It's a Boston suburb, not Watertown. So I walked in, and there's two sergeants there, an Army sergeant and an Air Force sergeant. And I identified myself. I said, I'm a reporter from the New American Magazine, and I'd like to ask a couple of questions. Yes, sir, what are your questions? I said, if some young man comes in here and he wants to join the military, do you tell him that he might be transferred to the United Nations Command? Boom. Sir, we can't answer that question. You're going to have to call over to the Air Force Base. So I call the Air Force Base in Bedford, Massachusetts. Same question. Boing. Can't answer that question. You're going to have to call San Antonio, big Air Force Base in San Antonio. I call San Antonio. Same thing again. I can't answer that question. You'll have to call the Pentagon. So I said, well, give me a phone number, will you? He did. I called the phone number, the Pentagon. Fellow got on the phone. I asked him the question. He was a lieutenant colonel. And he said, Mr. McManus, he said, I'm going to ask a favor of you. I'm going to ask that you not quote me. I got 3 weeks to go, and I'm retiring. He said, but you are absolutely right, and what is being done is absolutely wrong. But it took 4 phone calls to get an answer, and I just locked in finding a guy who was about to retire. At the end of the Korean War, you may recall that the war started, and it looked like they were going to totally succeed, the communists were going to push our troops into whatever was there, into the sea at the south end of the Korean Peninsula. When General Douglas MacArthur made the famous landing around at Incheon near Seoul, way up in the northern part of South Korea. 40-foot tides. They said it couldn't be done. He said, good, we'll do it. And they did. And they severed the lines of the North Korean army, and then they marched all the way up to the Yalu River at the top of the peninsula. North and South Korea were now all back in freedom. The war had been won. The Chinese communists massed across the border, and they flooded down. They were 20-to-1 in numbers to the American forces. MacArthur protested. They wouldn't let him do what he wanted to do. They wouldn't let him bomb the bridges over the river. They wouldn't let him do this. They wouldn't let him do that. He protested in a letter to Speaker of the House, Joseph Martin, and Truman fired him. And they put others in there who were ball-playing type generals, right? In 1954, there were hearings held at the State Department, in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And you see the quote at the bottom there, one of the generals who fought in Korea, General George Stratemeyer, we were required to lose the Korean War. Same statements made by General Van Fleet, General Mark Clark, and several others. They knew. Okay. Stratemeyer said, you get into war to win it. You do not get into war to stand still and lose it. And we were required to lose it. We were not permitted to win. All right, now who prevented them from winning? The United Nations, right? With the cooperation of the American military establishment back in Washington. General Douglas MacArthur commanded our troops in Korea, but was replaced for wanting to win. In his book, Reminiscences, he quoted the Chinese general at the time, Lin Peiao. Look what Lin Peiao said. I would never have made the attack and risked my men and military reputation if I had not been assured that Washington would restrain General MacArthur. Who gave him that assurance? Outrage did it. It was an outrage, right? But Lin Peiao said, I would not have attacked. I would not have crossed the Yalu River. I would not have taken on MacArthur and the American forces if I had not been assured that they would be restrained. And so it was a combination of the United Nations and traitorous diplomats in the State Department and in the Defense Department who restrained General MacArthur, right? Are we piling up reasons here why we should get out of the United Nations? Absolutely. All right. With NATO formed, now they decided to create a parallel organization called the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEATO, S-E-A-T-O. It was created in 1954. It's a duplicate of NATO, and it was cited as authorization to place U.S. troops in Vietnam. Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, here's Lyndon Johnson, 1967. We are in Vietnam because the United States and our allies are committed by the SEATO Treaty to act to meet the common danger of aggression in Southeast Asia. No doubt about it. SEATO ran the war in Vietnam. And SEATO is part of the UN, and therefore the UN ran the war in Vietnam, and therefore we lost. Didn't we? First time in the history of our country we lost a war. And in Vietnam, there were rules of engagement that were forced on our troops. These were finally dug out and published in the Congressional Record by Senator Barry Goldwater in 1985. And the rules of engagement went on and on and on with restrictions. Don't attack enemy planes on the ground. You can attack them when they're attacking you in the air. Don't attack truck convoys on a highway. You have to wait. You can't do it on a highway. No, excuse me, you could do it on a highway, but you couldn't do it if they were 200 yards off the highway. Don't close Haiphong Harbor, which was the North Vietnamese port city, the main supply port. Barry Goldwater in 1985, these rules unquestionably denied a military victory. Unquestionably. Now, how many of you know who Ken Burns is? Ken Burns is a film producer. He puts out documentaries. They're usually very good to watch, right? I had the experience recently of one of my neighbors had a relative come and visit. And they had a nice little gathering. I got chatting with this guy. And I said, you live up in New Hampshire? He says, yeah, I live up in New Hampshire. He says, in fact, he says, I'm friendly with Ken Burns, who lives in New Hampshire. I didn't know he lived in New Hampshire. I said, oh, yeah, well, what's he up to these days? He says, oh, he's starting a documentary on Vietnam. I said, is that right? I said, do you suppose he has the rules of engagement? He said, what are you talking about? So I had copied these out of the congressional record. It makes about 40 pages, right? I gave them to my friend, to my new friend, and I asked him, please give these to Ken Burns. I certainly will. He's confirmed to me that he's done it, right? So Ken Burns now has the rules of engagement, and we'll see if he uses them in the documentary that he's putting out about Vietnam. I'll be very interested to see that. I told my friend, I said, you tell Ken Burns that if he wants, I'll drive up to New Hampshire, sit down with him, and talk to him about it. Right? We'll see. You know, that's a case of a Bircher being in the right place at the right time, right? I know all kinds of incidents like that over the years where a Bircher had been at a strategic point and just simply passed along some information, and it made a difference, right? It made a difference. Okay, 1991, we had Desert Storm, right? Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait. Oh, this is terrible. George H.W. Bush says, we got to start the New World Order. He kept saying, New World Order. The Gulf crisis has to do with a new world order, and that world order is only going to be enhanced if this newly activated peacekeeping function of the United Nations proves to be effective. That's what President George H.W. Bush said. And he said it over and over and over again, right? Now, you may recall that we had 500,000 troops over there, and bingo, the war was over in a matter of weeks. It stopped suddenly. And a lot of people wonder, well, why didn't you go all the way to Baghdad? If Saddam Hussein is so bad, why didn't you go all the way to Baghdad? And the answer is the UN Security Council authorized only forcing Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. That's why the war ended. Again, the United Nations was running the show. The war stopped suddenly. Many wondered why. UN Security Council authorized only forcing Iraq out of Kuwait. And George W. Bush said over and over again that the whole operation was to strengthen the United Nations and bring on the New World Order. Okay, now we get the second Iraq War in 2003. Here's a copy of a letter that was sent by John Negroponte, who was our U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. He sent it to the Security Council. And he said right in the first paragraph, the actions being taken are authorized by existing council resolutions, including resolutions 678 and 687 and so on and so on. I have a copy of that letter. There's no doubt about it. The UN is, again, authorizing, and the United States is duly following, right? Look at this. One seeks authorization from a superior, not from an inferior. That says a mouthful, doesn't it? Who's the superior? The United Nations. Who's the inferior? Our country. Our country. Are we piling up reasons here why we got to get out of the UN? The Afghanistan war is still underway. Who's running that? NATO. NATO is running it. There's General Petraeus. There's a dead American. There's some troops in the field, right? So go back over quickly. UN wars. Korean War, the UN flags were flying. No doubt about it, right? So it's never been settled. Vietnam War was SEATO. We lost. Desert Storm, UN authorization. Second Iraq War, UN authorization. Afghanistan War, NATO. Ladies and gentlemen, is our military part of the United Nations? Absolutely. Absolutely. How many men and women in the military of the United States realize that? Very few, if any. You may recall that there was a young fellow over in Germany, and his unit was told, they were all handed patches to sew on their thing. The United Nations patch says, we're being transferred to Macedonia. We're going to be part of a UN operation in Macedonia. So tomorrow morning when we fall in, everybody should have the patch on. So they came out the next morning, and everybody had the patch on except one young fella. His name was Michael New, N-E-W. Mr. New, where's your patch? He said, it's in my pocket, sir. Why didn't you put it on your shirt? He said, because I joined the United States Army, I didn't join the United Nations Army. Mr. New, fall out. He fell out. They eventually court-martialed him. They ran him out of the military. He's living in Texas today.
Still fighting.
He was right. He was absolutely correct. And there were a lot of people that were looking around and waiting to see what would happen. And if he had not been summarily ditched and thrown out of the Army, there would have been a lot more to take that patch off. But they all got scared. Right? That's the way it works. In 2002, just before the second Iraq war, Congressman Ron Paul was a member of the House International Relations Committee. He stood up at a meeting. There were 45 congressmen present. And he said, Mr. Chairman, I move that we declare war on Iraq, and I intend to vote against my measure because I don't think we should go to war against Iraq. But I also don't think we should ignore the constitutional requirement for a congressional declaration of war. All right? Well, you can imagine there were some congressmen sitting back at this point saying, well, where's this going to go? Huh? What's going to happen here? Chairman Henry Hyde of the House International Relations Committee responded to Ron Paul. He said, Ron, there are things in the Constitution that have been overtaken by events, by time. Declaration of war is one of them. Your measure is inappropriate, anachronistic. It isn't done anymore. And he was called a conservative, right? He actually said that. I had some friends in Chicago where he's from, and I said, write to him and ask him if the part in the Constitution that says he shall be paid a compensation for service, should that be considered anachronistic as well? Right? And he never answered those letters. Right? And so Ron gave it a try, but he didn't get very far. Now, it gets even worse. In 1961, the State Department issued State Department Document 7277. It was called Freedom from War. And it called for the gradual turnover of the military of our country to the United Nations, formally. And it called for disarming the citizens. Right? It said in stage 3, disarmament would proceed to a point where no nation or person would have the military power to challenge the progressively strengthened UN peace force. Right? There's CFR member Dean Rusk, who was the Secretary of State at the time. I called down to Washington, and I got ahead of an individual who was in the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and I asked him about this. I said, I've got a document here. It's called Freedom from War, 7277. Oh, yes, I know about that. I said, is that still in force? Is that still? He said, absolutely. That's still part of the strategy of the United States, to turn over our military to the United Nations. Yes, sir, that's right. Thank you. Right? 1962, they came out with a document called A World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations. This was put together by a professor at MIT named Lincoln P. Bloomfield, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, as was Rusk. Right? It called for the total disarmament of civilians. It said membership in the new regime, far from being a privilege, would be mandatory. Right? Now, this is just a proposal, but this is the kind of thinking was going on in our country at the time. Now, gun foes want civilian disarmament, right? There's President Obama, the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty. The Senate said no. Yay. There's some more United Nations publications, and there's the famous statue that's in the courtyard of the UN headquarters in Washington, in New York City, right? And you can see a gun with its barrel twisted, tied in a knot, right? What's significant about it is that is not a military weapon. That is a civilian weapon, right? And that statue, it's as big as this podium, right? And taller than I am. They mean business. Now in New York State, you have New York Safe. Gun grabbers implement UN civilian disarmament, right? Do they mean to do that, right? I was asking some people just a little while ago, I said, what do you think is the most important word in the Second Amendment? Usually the response comes back, infringed is the most important word in the Second Amendment, right? No, it's not. The most important word is necessary, right? A militia is necessary if you're going to have a free state, and that's why the people right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Stop and think about that. The Founding Fathers said the people have to be armed to keep the government from taking the freedom. So the most important word in the Second Amendment is necessary. All right, here we have the gun control misses the mark. Senator Feinstein of California shoots off mouth, hits foot. There's an article from the New American Magazine. All right, now let's go back to the charter. We get to some other areas here. Article 2, paragraph 7 says, nothing in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the jurisdiction of any state. And by that they mean any nation, state. There was a diplomat at the time named Wadsworth. He had been in the State Department, he had been an ambassador, he had been a couple of other things. And he said if that had not been in the UN Charter, a lot more senators would have voted no. But they said, well, we don't have to worry about the UN meddling in our own affairs because they're prohibited from doing so. Have they kept that promise? Well, here's a flow chart from the United Nations. You know where I got that? At United Nations headquarters. I walked into the belly of the beast, and they're handing them out. Take one. I said, can I have a couple? Yeah, sure, have a couple. Right? Now, you can't read that. I know that. So let me summarize. What does it say? It says that the United Nations has tentacles in education, population, children, women, environment, trade, finance, health, agriculture, labor, military, science, culture, atomic power, telecommunications, aviation, industrial development, narcotics, refugees, property rights, and more. All on that flow chart, right? The United Nations never gets anything done. The United Nations, what are all those people in that building doing, right? There you got it, right there. What, all those other buildings, this is what they're doing, right? The United Nations is all over the place. UN intervening, Katanga. How many people know anything about Katanga? Province of the former Belgian Congo. In 1961, the United Nations invaded Katanga, shot up hospitals, shot up farms, shot up homes, shot people in the streets, right? Why? Well, there was a leader of Katanga whose name was Moise Chambé, and he was a great man, a good, solid citizen of his own country, and he's seceding from UN control over his country. It was about to be taken over by a communist that the UN had put in place in the western part of his country. And his Katanga province was in the eastern part of his country. So he said, we're out of here. We don't want anything to do with you guys, all right? And the United Nations came in and bombed the place, right? 46 doctors of the Katanga hospitals wrote a book called 46 Angry Men. And in it, there are pictures of the United Nations atrocities. They sent copies of their plea to the Pope, to President John Kennedy, to the leaders of European nations. Please, please get the United Nations to stop killing our people. Well, Chambé eventually won that struggle, and then he took a flight from his country up to Europe. The plane stopped in Algeria, he was taken off the plane and never seen again. Right? So did they intervene in Katanga? How about Rhodesia? Right? Rhodesia is now Zimbabwe. Yeah. I got a letter the other day from Zimbabwe from a man who reads the New American Magazine. And he just wrote to tell me thank you. He said, friends here in Zimbabwe wonder how come I am so well informed about world events. And I tell them I read a magazine from America called The New American. Thank you. Keep up your good work. How about Australia? The United Nations, people in Australia wanted to build a hydroelectric power plant. The United Nations came in and said that would upset a World Heritage Site that we have designated in your country. You can't build a power plant. Are they intervening in countries? Guatemala, they forced Guatemala to change its constitution to allow abortion. The European Union, they've destroyed the sovereignty of 28 nations, right? International Monetary Fund, World Bank, sending money to the wrong people here and the wrong people there all over the world. Our money in many cases, yes. Intervening in nations, yes. Contravening the Charter of the United Nations. They don't care about the Charter of the United Nations, right? How about in the United States? Any intervening here?
No.
No?
None.
No? About abortion. There's some people wanted to start a gold mine up in Montana, and they couldn't do it. The United Nations came in and said that will possibly interrupt the pristine area called Yellowstone National Park. UN officials have gone through our country and said, you've got to get rid of capital punishment. UN intervening in our country said, your border control policies are abominable. You've got to change them and allow the borders to be open. Right? They had judicial decisions being handed down by UN authority. And then the California Supreme Court Justice Frank Newman, who is now retired, he came out and he said, someday it will be malpractice for lawyers to fail to include UN human rights law in their cases. That's the way we're heading. If we don't get out of the UN, intervening in the United States. There's that statement for Frank Newman. How about Agenda 21? 1,100-page book. Right? It starts off with a summary by a lawyer named Frank Sitars, who is the editor of the 1,100-page book. Right? And this is a kind of a long quote, so I'll read it, and if you can see it, you can follow along with me. He said, Agenda 21 proposes an array of actions which are intended to be implemented by every person on earth. Effective execution will require a profound reorientation of all human society, unlike anything the world has ever experienced. And we continue. There are specific actions which are intended to be undertaken by multinational corporations and entrepreneurs, by financial institutions and individual investors, by high-tech companies and indigenous people, by workers and labor unions, by farmers and consumers, by students and schools, by governments and legislators, by scientists, by women, by children. In short, every person on earth will be required to accept and carry out what's in Agenda 21. Agenda 21 came from the United Nations Rio Conference in 1992. We sent my colleague Bill Jasper to Rio. He stayed there 10 days. He came back with this information. We've published it in the books, several books. But now we've got people all across the country using the pamphlets and the DVDs that we've put to counter Agenda 21, and it has caused an uproar. Good, good. Agenda 21 is a stealth program that is being implemented without the United Nations being mentioned, and it has to do with destroying property rights, family size, water rights, civil liberties, waste disposal, food, transportation, energy, education, children, and on and on and on you go. Every person on earth, said that guy Sitars, right? Here's some of the information we have about Agenda 21, a booklet and the DVD. You folks need that. And you need to get it to your city commissioners, your county commissioners, your local government people, because that's the way they're doing it, local committee, local community by community. Now, in addition to all of these other things, you folks in New York have cleaner, greener New York, right? I hate the way they've used the word green, right? See, I'm Irish, I like green. Right? So they've got cleaner, greener New York, right? And you see in the middle there, the new New York agenda, Andrew Cuomo's new agenda for a cleaner, greener New York, right? And it all came out of Agenda 21. Here's the New York, Vermont UNESCO Biosphere, UNESCO, United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, right? This is the largest biosphere that the UN has arranged to establish in the world, right? And it's right here in your state. It goes over into Vermont. Globalism for your children. Well, maybe you've heard about Common Core, right? Common Core is a new educational program. Before that, we had No Child Left Behind. Right? No Child Left Behind came as a result of a United Nations meeting in Thailand way back in the 1990s. It's a total failure. It was designed to be a total failure, right? Somebody told me recently, he said, well, the way to stop these Islamic jihadists is to send them to the American public school system and dumb them down. Common Core is United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. That's based in Paris, right? And that's what they want the children of our country. Now, this is going to take care of all the deficiencies that we've got. We're now 17th in science. We're 24th in math in all of the industrial countries, and it continues to get worse. I love to say that people who say we ought to spend more money on education obviously hate children, right? Right? Because the more money they put into it, the worse it gets, right? All right, the American Thinker is a publication that comes out and analyzes different things. They've done an analysis of Common Core. And they say some textbooks and curricula for our public schools have already been written by UNESCO. The focus includes sustainable development, abortion rights, gay marriage, universal disarmament, and social justice. Is that what we want our kids? How about reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? Right? Globalism for your children. The United Nations believes we should have a uniform global educational system. No, let's have competition. Competition produces excellence. Let's compete, right? The UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights was being taught for about an hour each day over an 8-week period in the Common Core program, right? All right? Now here's what's happened. Reading, writing, and arithmetic have been replaced by recycling, racism, and reproduction. The new 3 R's, right? That's what they're teaching the kids in the schools, right? Mommy, you gotta stop buying those plastic bottles full of water. Those plastic bottles are dangerous. Mommy, we gotta recycle. You know? Wouldn't you like to strangle some people? I would, right? Now, this is unbelievable, but it's true. Jacques Cousteau, that nice little man, used to go around in the ocean with his little boat, the Calypso, right? He actually stated and was quoted in the United Nations UNESCO Courier in Paris. He says, a terrible thing to have to say this. World population must be stabilized, and to do that, we must eliminate 350,000 people per day. We must get from 6 billion to 1 billion people on Earth. And they're not going to do that through attrition. They got programs in mind. And Jacques Cousteau is a monster. He's gone to meet his maker. I hope he atoned before he met the maker. But that's the thinking that goes along with Agenda 21. It goes along with all of the United Nations programs and so on. There's Robert Welch, a man that I looked on as a second father, really. I like to say he looked upon me as one of his sons. He said over and over again, withdraw the United States from the United Nations and you have broken the back of the world conspiracy. And you know what? It's doable. It can be done. If you folks will get your congressman and folks elsewhere will get their congressman, I'm going to give this speech 5 times in the next 2 weeks. And then I'm going to be going elsewhere and doing more of it. We're going to stimulate the people. We're going to jack up our get us out of the UN program. Right? And the way you can do that is to get the booklet that we've written. It's back there. Okay, let's make some conclusions. We're winding down here. This is a kind of a stark conclusion. The United Nations is not taking over the United States. The United States is being delivered to the United Nations. Start thinking that way. All right? We don't have to worry about Ban Ki-moon, who's the Secretary General. We have to worry about John Kerry and Chuck Hagel, right? CFR members. Conclusion number 2. Membership in the United Nations is completely incompatible with an independent United States and freedom for the American people. Absolutely. Completely incompatible. All right, number 3. Conclusion number 3. We've got 3 parts to this one. Should we reform the United Nations? No. Should we reduce our payments to the United Nations? Should we find a friendlier Secretary General? Should we get us out? Yes. Right. Ladies and gentlemen, that's a billboard that members of the Birch Society have erected. It's in Arizona. I got out of my car when I was riding past. I got out of my car. I wanted to genuflect. We got to start getting those signs up all across this country. Right? Yeah. You put it on your front lawn. Can we put it on your credit card? Okay, I told you there was a bill in Congress to get us out. It's called the American Sovereignty Restoration Act. For years, it was introduced by Congressman Ron Paul, who's now retired. Now it's Congressman Paul Brown of Georgia. He's an MD, Brown, B-R-O-U-N. The American Sovereignty Restoration Act, a measure to provide for complete withdrawal of the United States from the United Nations. So that's what you want to ask your congressman to co-sponsor. All right? Dear Mr. Congressman, it's time to get us out. I want you to co-sponsor the American Sovereignty Restoration Act, H.R. 75. Right. All right, what about this John Birch Society? Ed Clements has done a masterful job of telling us what's going on here. What is the John Birch Society? It's rock solid information. You can take it to the bank. You can take it to your congressman's office. You can take it to your neighbor, right? We got 5 decades of experience. Sorely needed national organization. What you folks do here in the New York area is being done in Oregon and in Texas and in North Dakota. Right? Right? It takes a national organization. We don't stress organization as much as we should. Right? Organization is key. It doesn't pay if just you folks know. We got to get other people to know all across the country. And we got a plan for victory. And the plan for victory is to wake the town, tell the people, and get decent people to represent us. And we start in the House of Representatives, then the Senate, and then the presidency, right? And it's not going to be Hillary, right? Our plan in a nutshell: inform ourselves on the principles and the interests. Understand the enemy. Ladies and gentlemen, you got to understand the enemy. What's the enemy here? The enemy is a conspiracy that has to be exposed. You got to understand that. Don't debate them, expose them. Educate and activate our friends. Grow membership in your congressional district. Train leaders and build chapters. Change the voting record or change the congressman. Restore constitutional government and maintain vigilance. Right? Every one of us can do all of that, and we should. There's my booklet, The United Nations Exposed. It was printed 2 weeks ago. It was delivered last week. It's brand new, right? And it's got everything and more that I talked about tonight in that booklet. So get one and then get 20 and then get 100 and start spreading them around. You know, I think we ought to get a sticker. We ought to put a little sticker on the front. This is what your children are not being taught in the public schools, right? All right? JBS motto, less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world. Only if we deserve it can we ask for God's help, right? Now let's go back a little bit in history, go back to a fellow named James Madison. I want to tell you about the Madisonian principle, right? He said it's proper to take alarm at the first experiment on our liberties. He said the free men of America, he's talking about his compatriots at that time, did not wait until usurped power had strengthened itself by exercise, right? They saw all the consequences in the principle, and they avoided the consequences by denying the principle, right? Now, what would be the principle here today? Membership in the United Nations, right? It's proper to take alarm at the first experiment on our liberties. The United Nations has given us many reasons for alarm. So Madison was right. And the commonly held attitudes are wrong. The UN is not just a forum for blowing off steam. It's not a group that has never accomplished anything. It's not a group that needs better leaders. It's not a place to talk rather than fight. It's an organization that means to control mankind. There's the JBS motto again. So the choice is ours. Less government or world governance. U.S. Constitution or UN Charter. God or no God. Right? There's no God at the United Nations. None at all. A better world or a new world order. There's the choices, right? And you've got that choice. I've got that choice. I'm doing what I can. I want you to do what you can. And how can you do it? More members in the John Birch Society will make the difference. Come join us in our proud companionship in our epic undertaking, said Robert Welch. And I'll close by saying the same thing to every one of you. Come join us in our proud companionship and in our epic undertaking. And thank you very much for your close attention.